everyone. Thank you for tuning in as we inaugurate a brand new podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. You're listening to episode 1 of Postmodern Realities, and I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. On this premiere episode, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Talon to discuss screenwriter, director, and filmmaker Quentin Tarantino. Dr. Talon is chair of the apologetics department at Houston Baptist University, and he also contributed an essay to the book Tarantino and Theology. He has written a feature article for the Christian Research Journal called Reservoir Gods, Quentin Tarantino's Premodern Theology, which will be published in our upcoming February 2016 issue. Quentin Tarantino is the writer and director of many well-known films, including Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs, Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2, Django Unchained, and his latest release in theaters now, The Hateful Eight. Phil, it's good to have you on.
Oh, glad to be here.
Tarantino's films are fairly violent and profane, so I guess the first question is, why should a Christian even want to watch his films or should watch his films?
Well, that's a very good question, and that does tend to be the first question that comes up when discussing Tarantino in Christian circles. It's helpful at least to begin by talking about his violence, because that, from the very beginning of his career, has been an issue that's dogged his film. So from his very first film that premiered at Sundance, Reservoir Dogs, many critics, even critics that don't have Christian convictions, have wondered about the morality portraying this violence. And so this just then raises the question of what's the place of violence in literature and film. Is it always inappropriate? And it's notable that Tarantino's films often offend even people that tend to like violence in movies. So Star Wars, which is an action film which has a fair amount of violence, has just come out. It's been very successful. Almost no one has raised any sort of questions. And so in looking at Tarantino's films, we have to ask this question of why his films in particular tend to raise this sort of moral question because of their portrayal of violence. And when you look especially at the early films that didn't have a very high body count, very few people die in Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction, you wonder, okay, well, these aren't excessively violent like something like Kill Bill later on, but they're upsetting, people don't like them. And so the thing that becomes apparent is the way that Tarantino presents violence is often much more upsetting and unsettling than a lot of other filmmakers. So strangely, he's often critiqued for being too violent, partly because he actually portrays, to some degree, the kind of the seriousness, the bloodiness, the awfulness of violence.
Wouldn't you say, though, that some of his films have become more increasingly graphic? In other words, in Pulp Fiction, it was violent, but the violence was somewhat off-screen. It seems like he's evolved where things are extremely graphic, if you think of like the violence in Django Unchained, for example.
Yeah, that's right. Though I wouldn't say that the violence has become more upsetting as it's become more graphic. So the ear-cutting scene in Reservoir Dogs, which is probably his most famous work of cinematic violence, actually takes place off-screen, but that, even amongst adult men that normally like, rated R movies, is often a scene that they just, can't stomach watching. So his films have become more cartoonishly violent, more bloody. The body count has risen over time, but a lot of the objections, the reasons that people have problems with Tarantino are there from the beginning. And so what I would say is that part of the reason why Tarantino's films raise moral questions is because very often he'll juxtapose very upsetting violence with other scenes that have humor, other scenes that are very kind of lighthearted or that that make us chuckle, and he'll sort of push these uncomfortably close together, and so that we begin to wonder if we're actually laughing at this awful violence. We begin to raise questions and sort of wonder about the nature of on-screen violence, and that in a way is part of what it is to think about and watch a Tarantino movie, is to think about these questions, to wonder what's the role of violence, why am I laughing at this, should I be laughing at this? That's actually part of the effect that he's going for.
So if I'm somebody, or if our listeners are people who just can't stomach that violence, why should they be aware of Quentin Tarantino as a filmmaker? Is there something that he's been doing as a filmmaker over his career that has been impactful on the industry as a whole?
Yeah, so and to be clear, I don't think that Tarantino's for everybody, and they're more than I think that almost any artist is for everyone. But I do think that he's someone that Christians that want to be culturally engaged should be aware of. His work has been incredibly influential since the 90s when he came onto the scene. He was part of a kind of an explosion of independent cinema in the 90s, and among all the other directors that came out at that time that have had very successful careers, people like Steven Soderbergh or Robert Rodriguez or Richard Linklater, he's the one who has risen kind of the fastest and entrenched himself basically in that kind of the highest pantheon of directors, really the only director since the 70s who's been able to establish his name as a kind of a top 10 director. So he's certainly culturally significant. I don't think he's made a bad movie yet. Some of his movies are better than others, and a few have pretty significant flaws, but he's certainly a great filmmaker that people should be aware of, and especially recently he's been entering into the cultural conversation in a way that I think is noteworthy. So his most recent two movies have dealt with American issues, especially surrounding slavery, black and white relations, dealing with questions of racism, and they're not always he doesn't always handle them in very tidy ways, but he's trying to continue to engage in this conversation. And so people that are interested in these sort of questions should be aware of his work at the very least.
Well, if some people are just trying to get started, okay, I'm willing to watch a Tarantino film, what do you think would be just essential viewing for them? And how do you rank his various films?
Well, I think I said before that I don't think Tarantino's made a bad movie, and so almost any of his films have really interesting, significant things about them. I think generally, though, you could probably start at the beginning and you'll be getting his most consistently good films. Pulp Fiction, which is his second film, is, I think, his best film. Most critics would say so, which has to be quite a daunting thing to be a young 20-something filmmaker and your second movie to be, basically what everybody says is going to be your best, and you're an unsurpassable film. And so I would say start at the beginning with Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs, Jackie Brown. These are early films. They're crime films set in contemporary L.A., and they introduce you to Tarantino's sensibilities, and then we'll kind of lead you into his later films, which are much more kind of broad, or in a sense, Tarantino intensified and made more extreme genre elements, more extreme allusions to other works in cinema, and then also, and I think probably his least good films have been clustered toward the end. Django Unchained and Hateful Eight, I think, are toward the bottom of his list, which is still a very good list, but those are the ones that I say if somebody's going to miss a Tarantino film, those are the skippable ones.
You talked about his filmmaking changing over time. Do you think that he's being more issue-focused now than he has been in the past?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think that there is, in one sense, Tarantino is a filmmaker that is not really ever interested in conveying a big idea or, carrying a message. So he's a bit like Hitchcock, and Hitchcock, famously said, "Save the messages for Western Union." For Tarantino, it's about the power, the emotional impact and effect of cinema on us. And so his movies, like someone like Hitchcock, are kind of about themselves. They're about cinema and the way that it works. And so they're very much visceral experiences more than intellectual experiences. To contrast that, say, with a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, who's also been doing a lot of really great work recently, and his movies are always centered on some kind of idea or question. However, in the last few films, especially as Tarantino has dealt with issues of race, it's become more necessary to think through and discuss the way that his movies are treating certain ideas about the American experience, American history, the stain of racism on American life, and think about ways that we can move beyond it. There's another question that his most recent film raises that I think is worth discussing also, which is that he seems to be dealing with the question of what constitutes true justice what separates justice from revenge. And partly, I think that's an attempt on his own part to begin to look for a way out of a cycle of films that he's been making over his last 5 movies or so, starting with Kill Bill, that deal almost exclusively with revenge. So Kill Bill is about a mother's revenge. A movie called Inglourious Basterds is about revenge against the Nazis in World War II by some Jewish soldiers. And Django Unchained was about a slave's revenge on white slaveholders. And then in The Hateful Eight, we have characters dealing with these kind of questions of what separates revenge from justice, and beginning to think through how to kind of move outside of this continual cycle of revenge. So there are some ideas in Tarantino that are worth discussing, even if rarely are the ideas the main focus in his work. He's much more interested, I think, in how is he channeling his influences. What are the playful effects that he's using in storytelling? What's going on the screen itself, rather than what ideas are going on kind of behind the character's eyes.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute, CRI, and its magazine, the Christian Research Journal. Now, this podcast was founded in 2016 and has hundreds of episodes where we interview the various authors that write for the Christian Research Journal on Christian apologetics, Christian living, and also a lot of cultural apologetics, where we review films and television shows and books for you. And so we have a lot of past content that you can discover when you subscribe to us on your favorite podcast streaming service like Apple Podcasts or also Google Play. We're on Spreaker and a lot of other platforms, so you can find us where you get your podcasts. You might want to go over to our website, equip.org, because there you can subscribe. And with the subscription to the Christian Research Journal, you receive early access to all of our online exclusive articles that are featured on this podcast that are only available to be read by our subscribers. But we know that not everyone's budget has room for a subscription, so if you would like to give us a tip instead to help us keep all of this content free and coming to you on a regular basis, please go to our website, equip.org. If you click on Journal, you'll see a tab there for Postmodern Realities Podcast. If you click on it at any landing page of any of the episodes, you will find there is a link where you can also give us a tip. Now, the other thing that you can do to really help us out is just the gift of your time. If you go on to your favorite podcast platform, but more specifically, Apple Podcasts, and rate and review our podcast specifically, it really helps to have a short sentence about why you listen. This helps more people to find our content because the algorithm on the internet sees that it is a podcast of interest to people. So helping us out that way and partnering that way just costs you your time, not any actual money, and we would really appreciate your partnership. So thank you for being a listener. There's a lot to discover in more than 300 episodes and going of the Postmodern Realities podcast. We were just talking, Phil, about the themes of revenge. And so as Christians, how do we process that? What is an apologetic value for us to immerse ourselves in a theme that has this kind of, visceral reaction where we're kind of rooting for people to take revenge against their oppressor?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question, and I think it forces us to ask questions about the nature of Tarantino's work. What kinds of stories is he telling? What do they assume about the world? What do they assume about the way the world should be? And in this sense, we're really beginning to move into the territory of apologetics, because I don't think that Tarantino's work can be fit neatly into a Christian worldview, which is to say that there are elements that he shares with a Christian worldview, which is there is a desire for some kind of justice. There is still a kind of a basic morality. He's ultimately on the side of the good guys, but his moral imagination shares much more in common with ancient Greeks or ancient Romans, or even with some of the kind of the world of the people that in the Old Testament are interacting with, which is a much simpler moral code. It seems to be more focused on kind of, this is our group and those outside are bad. So you have, for instance, in Inglourious Bastards, this elite army troop is invading Nazi Germany, and they're deliberately scalping their Nazi enemies in the way that the Apaches had. And they're doing this in order to make the Germans fear this troop of elite soldiers. And so the way that Tarantino is channeling this kind of older tribal pagan way of being, to me, suggests that his allegiances and his interests are much more in line with the world of the Iliad or the world of the Odyssey than they are with the world that we now live in as a result of the Christian gospel sort of penetrating the imaginations of everyone, even those who don't believe it. So in engaging with Tarantino's films, we're dialoguing with them much in the way that we would be with pagan people. We're recognizing that there are some similarities, but also some crucial differences between the way that he's portraying justice and what we would see as being something that surpasses justice, which is forgiveness and mercy.
I think Quentin Tarantino's films raise objections both from, conservatives and progressive people. And I would think that this particular movie, which I also saw, The Hateful Eight, which is in theaters now, had that reaction. There were some, progressive film critics who really objected to the violence in the film. So why do you think people on both kind of spectrums object to some of his content?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I think Dana Stevens in Slate, said that this movie was possibly evil, and she's not coming at it from a, Christian position. She's basically a secular film critic and that is her perception. So there is a very interesting way that Tarantino kind of is an equal opportunity offender, which is that different people will have issues with his movies for very different reasons. I found, again, as with all Tarantino films, it's not a movie that's for everyone. It has, much strong language in it. He said it in the postbellum South, and people speak the way that they did and during that time. And there's also, especially toward the end, very extreme and kind of hard to take violence. But the movie overall seemed to be heading in a hopeful direction. I don't think it gets to a place of hope, but it suggested that Tarantino, as I said before, is sort of perhaps trying to get back to some of the territory of his early films, which is in Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown. You have a very fallen world, people who are entangled with crime and violence, but there's a sorrow or a sense of loss that pervades those movies, and a desire for some kind of redemption, for an ability to escape from this cycle. And with the last 4 or 5 movies, starting with Kill Bill and on through, we very much had a kind of this world of revenge and sort of nonstop violence all the time, where Hateful Eight is still locked very much in that kind of world of cartoonish violence, but seems at the very end to kind of be reaching up its hand and looking for a way out. And while it's not a perfect film, I think that at least is a hopeful direction for Tarantino's career. Now back to the question that you started with, which is, why is this movie raise objections? Tarantino portrays, very, very sinful people, and so as one wit observed, it's hard to have a sinless literature of sinful people, and so the attitudes toward women and violence toward women in the film reflect, the views of people, very rough men, bounty hunters living at that time, and Tarantino portrays that. he doesn't necessarily endorse it, but the film also doesn't go out of its way to condemn it either. And so there's a way that Tarantino's movies, I think, in order to be properly morally viewed, require a fairly robust critical interaction of thinking, questioning our own enjoyment of certain elements in order to make sure that we're not allowing his work to kind of steal past the watchful dragons of our reason and cause us to develop sentiments that aren't really in line with what God has for us. So I think that there's a way that we're required to bring some extra analysis, critical reflection, so that we can avoid falling prey to some really problematic elements in his films.
Quentin Tarantino has himself talked about ceasing to make more films once he's past a certain point. Do you envision him stopping his filmmaking career?
Well, I do know that he said he's going to stop at 10, and he has taken breaks. There have been times when he's sort of gotten stalled. There was a long pause in between Jackie Brown and Kill Bill, and there was another break in there before he was able to get back into it. I'm sure it must be a challenging thing to have such a shining legacy as a very young filmmaker and to not want to tarnish that by making too many bad movies. So he said he's going to stop at 10. I sort of doubt that he's going to, because he's just one of the most naturally gifted filmmakers that we've seen. Just right out the gate, he's making really incredible films. So I'm dubious that that's what he's actually going to do, and I hope that he doesn't, because I enjoy seeing and thinking about and writing about his movies. But we shall see. This would be Hateful Eight would be his 8th film, appropriately enough. So that would only leave 2 more. At the rate he's going, at about, on average, one every 3 or 4 years, that would mean within 10 years or so he would be finished. So we shall see. He has said that he wants to write novels and other works of criticism, and so he'll still be busy creating something, I'm sure.
Yes, he also said that he'd like to do some plays, so we'll see how that goes. It seems to me that, as I watched Hateful Eight, it seemed very much like it could be set up as a play. Well, if you had to
It was like, almost like an Agatha Christie, Murder on the Orient Express play or something. And I think that he actually has plans to stage Hateful Eight as a play.
So if you had to pick just one Tarantino film to watch, which one would it be?
The movie that I would say this is the best Tarantino's done. This is the one to watch and think about is without a doubt Pulp Fiction. It was the first movie of his that I saw, and the one that really was why I got into watching movies to begin with. Somebody had a VHS tape that had just come out. I had just graduated from high school, and they said, "Hey, you should watch this." And so I went home and watched it, and it totally opened my mind. I didn't know that movies could be like that. It could be so visceral and thoughtful and playful at the same time, and really harsh, dealing with some very kind of ugly things, but also looking, with elements of grace mixed in. The movie is very much about the kind of interruption of grace into an extremely sinful world, and we get to see how different characters either respond to or reject that offer, and then what happens to them as a result. So it's a film that I think is, really does have a strong connection to the Christian worldview, and seems to be the place where he gets kind of closest to making a film that fits within a Christian worldview.
Well, finally, I'm going to end each Postmodern Realities podcast with asking our guests some fun rapid-fire questions. So, Phil, here we go. Mac or PC?
Oh, PC all the way. I prefer my computers not to have many viruses and a bunch of malware on it. So,
okay, chicken or beef?
Beef, absolutely. One thing is, if you undercook it, it's actually better. So, yeah, beef. Okay,
are you a morning person or a night person?
I really neither. I like to sleep in, and I'm not very functional at night. So, I guess I'm an afternoon person.
And lastly, since we've been talking about Quentin Tarantino and filmmaking, what's a film in the last year you've watched that you think people need to see?
I should have a a better answer to that one right off the bat. Unfortunately, because I have so many other responsibilities now, I haven't been able to get out to see quite as many movies as I'd like. But the film from 2014 that I thought was the best, which I've just recently caught up with, is a film called Calvary, and it is about it's an Irish independent film starring Brendan Gleeson, and he's a Catholic priest who, he's taking confession one day, a man comes in and tells him because of all the things that the church has done to him, he's going to kill him. And so it's about this priest's week where he goes about his work trying to minister to people and knowing that at the end of that week, a man is going to come after him and kill him. And it's really an incredible story about what it means to do ministry in an age when people have lost faith in the church, and what that means to sort of be Christ-like and to be bold in your proclamation while also dealing with so many doubts. So it's a wonderful film for apologists or really anyone who is working in ministry to watch. So that film is called Calvary.
Great. Well, I've not seen that one, and I'm going to put that one on my list. Well, I want to say thank you to Phil Talon for being our first guest on our Postmodern Realities podcast.
Well, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Again, Phil has written an article for the Christian Research Journal called Reservoir Gods, Quentin Tarantino's Premodern Theology. You won't want to miss it. And a 6-issue subscription to the journal is $39.50. To subscribe online, please go to our website, www.equip.org. And also, be sure you tune in every day to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, and he answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank your question, call 1-888-ASK-HANK at 6 p.m. daily Eastern Time.